ideology is the enemy of good theology. And I really like this conversation because you have this juxtaposition between Russel Brand on one side, who's kind of this cosmic spiritualist, and then you have Richard Dawkins on the other, who's this very kind of committed atheist, almost ideologically committed to atheism. And that's where the trouble is, and we can kind of see this as an analogy for society, that's all that's going on today, because you have people on one side that are like, not really interested in the truth. They're committed to their ideas, and anytime you challenge those ideas, you are seen as being antagonistic. And so if we're going to continue dialogue moving forward, I think we should learn from this conversation, because ideology can be the enemy of that dialogue, that good conversation that we need to have. So let's take a step back and be committed to truth and not ideology. That, I think, is key. When you're committed to truth, though it's uncomfortable to have your ideas challenged, in the end, it's okay. You can let go of some of those ideas in favor of the truth that is coming at you.
Richard Dawkins, the foremost atheist in the land, talking to me, one of the world's most religiousist folks.
Science is interesting, and if you don't agree, you can f*** off.
I mean, how's it going to go down? Do you feel that society's in trouble?
Maybe I do.
Yeah.
Yes. But
Right.
So
what do you think the answer is?
Well, not religion.
Why did Dawkins take this interview? That's what I want to know. I think we'll get to. I have a theory, but we'll have to see if it comes out in this interview. Why would Richard Dawkins sit down with Russel Brand for this?
Well, I do.
I think religion is relatively too small to deal with big problems.
There's this assumption that science and religion are at odds with one another.
I agree that there's a lot we don't know, we may never know. And I want to know. I want to work on knowing.
How come you're doing this?
I don't know, that's really interesting.
These are some of the things I've always wanted to ask you about. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I've been looking forward to speaking to you for a very long while because, well, quite a lot of things, as a matter of fact. I wonder, mostly, where you feel the conversation about deism and theism currently resides. If there...
Okay, we're already into definitions. Deism, deism. Okay, the idea God is created everything but kind of left it alone. Okay, that's a basic definition. Like the watch, maker who made the watch wound it up and then set it off. No miracles. God's not involved in human history the way maybe you would believe in Christianity, Judaism, stuff like that. Definitions are important.
There's anything that you would amend around your evolving discourse from the point where it became, in a sense, one of the key components of the cultural conversation around faith and atheism in, I guess it was maybe the late 90s when the selfish gene certainly came to my attention. I wonder if your views have altered and what, if anything, you see as being valuable in a spiritual perspective.
Most of my books have been about evolution, starting in 1976 with the selfish gene. And then I suppose the main book on atheism is The God Delusion, which was, I believe, 2006.
Why does he answer this question by referring to his books? The question, and I know, Russell, you got to kind of navigate some of the word salad that he uses. But he's asking, have you changed any of your beliefs? Have you, have your beliefs evolved? And what value is there in spirituality? And he's like, I've just written a lot of books on atheism. I've written a lot of books on evolution. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but that doesn't seem like an answer to the question.
But mostly I'm a scientist. I regard religion as scientifically interesting, in the sense that if religious belief is true, if there is a creator of the universe, then it's a very, very different kind of universe from if there isn't.
Yes, very good question. And I'm agreeing with Dawkins here. I'm not setting this up as like a response video. I don't care for those. I want to create dialogue. And it seems like the internet is the best place, not the best place, but it's one of the places that we can do that. And so I actually really appreciate this take from Richard Dawkins, because I 100% agree. Tozer said, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. It will influence the way we live our lives. And so yes, the scientific question, the question definitely changes if you believe that God exists as opposed to not believing God exists. I think it's interesting, though, also that it is the belief in God that kind of spurred on science, that if there was a God who created this world, then the world should be understandable. And you can look at John Lennox. John Lennox and Richard Dawkins actually did a good debate on this subject. And Lennox said, I'm not an atheist because it would destroy my view of God. I'm not an atheist because it would destroy my ability to do science. Because if there is no creator out there, if the world came from just some unguided random process, then why would I expect to learn anything by making observations if there's not a mind behind it?
And so it's a very profoundly important scientific question whether there is a creator of the universe, an intelligent being who lurks behind the laws of physics, the laws of science, or whether there's not. Because if there is, then it's an utterly different scientific enterprise that we're engaged upon. We would be engaged upon trying to work out how his mind works. Whereas if there isn't one, as I believe, then it's an entirely different kind of enterprise.
But isn't it that much more interesting to think, we're gonna work out how the mind of God works? That's what we're doing. When we're doing science, we're engaging with the mind of an infinite personal creator. That's fascinating. I don't know why science would be fascinating if there isn't a God out there that we're engaged with. And maybe I'm biased. Maybe that's my ideological... I'm locked in there.
I do think it's a very important question.
C.S. Lewis said that there's this sort of, obviously he was famously an atheist who became a Christian at some point in his life. Used the phrase, the idea that nature is haunted. He used the idea of the nuministic and numinism as one of the coordinates around which a discussion in favour of a omniscient being might centre.
Numinism. I don't think he doesn't define this term for us, so we have to assume what Russel Brand is talking about here. I'm going to go with this idea. Okay, pneuma having to do with spirit, breath, wind. You can think of a pneumatic drill if you want to, but it's this word, and it's used in Scripture. Jesus is using it here to refer to the Holy Spirit, the Spirit of God, numinism, spiritualism, and maybe it takes different forms in different world religions out there. I can only speak from my context. So numinism to have to do with the spirit or spirituality. I'm assuming. Russell, if you want to come on the podcast and define terms for me, you can. You're welcome.
I wonder if within your studies of evolutionary biology, and of course it's perhaps the most obvious question anyone could ask you, if even within the patterns that you observe, there is a sense of intelligence or even teleology.
No, there isn't, but there's a very, very strong illusion of it.
Wow, this answer blows my mind, actually. Okay, teleology. Okay, sorry, we have to define our terms again. The telos, the purpose, the ultimate end for which a thing exists. So if there is no telos, there is no purpose for any of what we're observing as scientists. There isn't. He just goes and says that. He just said, no, there's no telos. There's no ultimate meaning. There's no ultimate end. There's no purpose or design. But there's a strong appearance of it. I mean, how do we work that out? It's like, isn't science all about observation? And you go with what you're observing, and then when what you're observing looks like an intelligent design is behind the natural world, you go with that answer. You go with the answer that best explains the evidence. But here he's saying, yeah, it really looks like there's an intelligent design out, or it really looks like there's a telos, which would lead to a designer. But let's just say it really looks like there's a telos, but there's not. That just blows my mind. And again, is this an ideological commitment? Not interested in truth here, but interested in perpetuating an ideology that I've already bought into. I don't know how, I'm not trying to be harsh on Richard Dawkins. I actually have a lot of respect for Dawkins to some degree. I struggle with that. I struggle with how that's not an ideological point rather than a scientific, like an honest scientific point.
This is one of the main things that Darwin faced. The living world especially has an amazingly strong appearance of design. You only got to look at any animal, look at your dog, look at a tree, look at an insect that beautifully mimics a leaf or a stick or something of that sort. It looks as though it's got design written all over it. And it was the genius of Darwin to see that that didn't have to mean there really was a designer.
So everything looks like it's designed. But the genius of Darwin is that we don't have to have a designer. I guess maybe I'm missing something. How do you get to... that just seems like a leap. You haven't given me any evidence. You've just said everything looks designed, but it's not.
Although that, I don't know that Darwin explicitly said that there wasn't a designer. Like the theory of natural selection prohibits the idea that there is an intelligence or a god or a creative force or creative component behind the processes of evolution. And what?
Okay. Does anybody know what there's Darwin, Origin of Species, and then there's a subtitle to the Origin of Species. Does anybody know what it is? Don't Google it. Does anybody know? Tell us in the comments. Do you know what the subtitle is to Origin of Species? You will know what Darwin was working with. He wasn't trying... look it up. It's fascinating. Darwin was working with an assumption, let's just say.
What do you think about Alfred Russel Wallace's contribution to those theories and how they aligned with some of his interests, for example, in sort of mysticism?
Yes. Wallace and Darwin definitely independently arrived at the same idea. So Wallace does deserve great credit. Darwin had it first, but he didn't publish. And so it was, as you know, it was Wallace's paper that he sent to Darwin in 1858, which spurred Darwin on to write The Origin of Species. So Wallace and Darwin independently discovered it. Wallace actually described himself as more Darwinian than Darwin at one point. He even thought that Darwin was a bit too mystical. Surprisingly, that obviously surprises you, and as so it should, because later on in his life, as you know, Wallace did become quite mystical. Wallace became a spiritualist. He became interested in communicating with the...
Now, is this because, we're trying to explain the world the way it actually is, and we want to have an explanation that's consistent with what we're observing. So here you have Wallace saying Darwin was too mystical originally, and yet later on, himself becoming a mystic. Is that because in our modern reductionist naturalism cannot explain with full force everything we see in the world? And that's, people are wondering about aliens and all this other stuff that's going on right now that we can't explain with our naturalistic assumptions because the world is more than the natural realm. That's probably why these guys landed into some kind of mysticism.
The dead, so there was a bit of a box and cox relationship between them over sexual selection, which, as you know, is the idea that not just survival, but attraction to the opposite sex or ability to fight for the opposite sex was an important aspect of natural selection. Darwin called it sexual selection. And with respect to attraction of the opposite sex, things like the peacock's tail, Darwin was content to say that peahens just like beautiful, magnificent, embroidered tails.
Beautiful, magnificent, embroidered. You can't escape the language. Where does beauty come from? Does beauty come when, random things happen? No, beauty is communicating something. There's pattern, like a piece of art. He said embroidered. What is embroidery if not a type of artwork?
Was content to say that peahens just like beautiful, magnificent, embroidered tails. Wallace hated that. Wallace thought that was too mystical, and Wallace wanted there to be a fully rational explanation for sexual selection. And so that's one of the main disagreements between Wallace and Darwin, where Darwin was thought to be on the more mystical side rather than Wallace. But then later on in life, Wallace, as I say, became a spiritualist and was interested in communicating. Wallace thought that we survived our death, and Wallace wanted to communicate with the dead. So
that's teleology. That's the question of telos. What is the ultimate end? Where's everything going? And, People think that theism comes in as a gap in our knowledge. Like, oh, we can't explain this. Insert God to explain it, as though it's like a God of the gaps. Like, just put God wherever we don't have knowledge, and the more knowledge we gain, the less we need God. Except that the more knowledge we gain, truly, the more we realize we don't understand. And so I think that there's kind of a misidentified duality, maybe. I don't know if that's the right way to say that, but that rationalism and spirituality, or even mysticism to some degree, cannot be coherent. They can't come together. I think that the more, but it does come together in theology. The more I learn about God, the more I'm fascinated about God, the more I desire to learn about God, the more my own ignorance is exposed. I'm not thinking about God irrationally. I'm thinking very rationally about God and doing theology very rationally. But I'm also open to mystery and the idea that I'm finite, God is infinite. So I'm never going to exhaust the subject of God. Paul Vanderklay, I think, said this. I don't know where he maybe got it from. Maybe he came up with it himself. So all credit to Paul there. Knowledge is the enemy of enchantment. And I think that that is true in every area of life except the theological area. Because the more I gain in knowledge of God, the more I'm enchanted by that person. So yeah, this kind of rationalism and mysticism, I used to think were mutually exclusive. And I'm not as convinced anymore. The more I do theology, the more I realize that there's always going to be a sense of mystery when we do theology correctly. And that should inspire us to do more theology and to do more thinking. And so it's not the enemy of rationalism. They're kind of co-laborers when it comes to theology. I hope I got that Paul Vanderklay quote correctly. Thank you for sticking with me as I kind of work this out in my mind out loud.
So as I said, it was an interesting kind of reversal of roles.
Also, that him saying that Darwin's not Darwinian enough, the nerve. But you say it's an important scientific question, and I can appreciate why it would be. Although, but I'd love you to unpack that further if over the course of our conversation. But also,
okay. Also, Russel Brand is a comedian. I think that's also a juxtaposition. You have comedy on one side, which is poetic, and then you have, in a sense, philosophy. Although I don't think, with all due respect to Richard Dawkins, I don't think he's a very good philosopher. And so you have this, again, is that the juxtaposition of if I can allow myself to think freely, to come into contact with other ideas that challenge me, isn't that found in my ability to engage in humor, engage in comedy? You see that right now. There's a thought war going on in society right now, particularly in the West, I guess, probably everywhere. It's like there's these people who cannot laugh at themselves, and that is as tragic as their ideology is. The fact that they've lost their humor is maybe equally as tragic as the fact that they're deluded into thinking things that aren't really helpful for them, their lives, and so they're sort of trapped in these really kind of destructive thoughts and things like that. Destructive grappling with. Well, they're not even grappling with it. They're captivated by these destructive ideas that are not truths, so they don't set anyone free. And isn't that it right there? When you're free to laugh at yourself. That's how that's the idea of liberal education, to liberate. And the library in Latin is similar. They're like the book, the word is the thing that liberates you. So the ability to engage with the truth allows you to be free, allows you to do comedy. Sorry, that was a little bit of a rant.
It's an important social. There's an important social implication. I feel I guess the reason that when I speak with atheists, I usually end up becoming quite passionate. I believe in God myself, and these are some of the things I've always wanted to ask you about. We see that distinction that Wallace seems to draw between the rational and the spiritual, identifying that there are certain categories where rational discourse is necessary and ought to be pursued to its zenith or nadir, certainly pursued to the point of exhaustion, and yet there is territory that remains. I feel consistently, Professor, that there are limitations to what a human might know, that there is a limit to our understanding, but knowledge itself is unlimited. The potential for knowledge is unlimited, as with the range, the limitations with what we can decipher through the senses, the amount of the electromagnetic light spectrum that we can witness, the amount of olfactory and audible information that we have access to. And if there is limitation even within the sensory realms that we can identify because we have the instruments, there is observable limitation. Is it reasonable to suggest that there might be entire dimensions and realms of data to which we do not have access? And the assumption that because we cannot measure them, they are not there is such a sort of a limiting premise. And whilst I understand what the science is, and science is about what can be measured and what can be observed, is this not an important time to once again mark the bifurcation that Wallace appears to note, that the rational has its realm and the mystery has its realm also? Well,
this is...
You got to hang in there with the Russel Brand. That's not even a word salad. That's like a word pasta right there. That's spaghetti noodles of words. Russell is actually he's really smart. And I think most people fill the space with like ums and pauses and things like that. He fills them with with vocabulary. He fills those empty spaces with vocabulary. And I think he's touching on what we just said. And I know that was fast. But he's basically saying there's limits to our knowledge, and yet it seems like knowledge might be infinite. Well, and I would say yes, in the sense that God is infinite. So our knowledge of God will go on and perpetuate forever. We will never have infinite knowledge because our nature is that we are finite people. That's just our nature. We'll never become infinite. We'll never have infinite knowledge because of that. And yet we have access to infinite knowledge in the mind of God. That's wild. That's wild to think about it.
This is very interesting. As a matter of fact, the last chapter of my book, The God Delusion, does use that very analogy of the electromagnetic spectrum. We can only see a tiny, tiny fraction of the electromagnetic spectrum, and it extends hugely in either direction from the visual. And so I have every sympathy with the idea that there's a lot that we don't understand. That's certainly true. And there may be a lot that we cannot understand. I think there may be physicists, I think, are open-minded about whether there are questions that physicists will never be able to understand because of the limitations of the human mind. And I would look at this as not at all surprising, because our brain, for me as a Darwinian, our brain was fashioned by natural selection on the Darwinian, on the African plains. And it's a device to help us to survive and reproduce in Africa at that time. And in a way, the astonishing thing is that we have advanced so far beyond that. I mean, who could have foreseen Einstein? Who could have foreseen quantum theory? The fact that the human brain that was built to survive as a hunter-gatherer can actually do relativity, can actually do advanced physics, can actually do poetry, can do philosophy, can do mathematics.
But we've always been able to do those things. If you take an honest look at history, it's not that the human mind has become more powerful over time. There's an argument to be made that the human mind has actually become less powerful over time, that we use less of our brain today than, and I'm doing dreaded air quotes here, primitive people. And again, I think this is something that to me causes me to believe that Richard Dawkins is kind of still stuck in an ideological framework, because he's not looking at human history honestly. There are things that humanity has always been able to do, mapping the stars, for example. I mean, that's not a simple thing to do, and looks like they would have had to have a system of passing down that knowledge through generations prior to the invention of the alphabet and the written language. So it's not that the ancient people had primitive minds unable to do quantum mechanics, is that they had very advanced minds. They just used them in different ways. And I think an honest take here would be that the human mind is able to explore these things And is evolution a good enough explanation for how we got there? I don't think it is. I don't see how you can invoke an unguided or random process. I realize some people don't like that idea that it was random, natural selection or whatever. But if there's no telos, if there's no ultimate end or goal, there's no purpose, then I don't know how you escape the idea of randomness. And so the question is still, how is the human mind able to do these things today? I don't think evolution is a good enough explanation for that. But that's just me. You can hit me up in the comments and let me know where I'm off, if I'm off there.
So already we've advanced far beyond what a utilitarian might think that we ought to. And the question is there a limit? Are there some important truths that the human brain can never master? Are there beings in the universe, extraterrestrial beings perhaps, who already understand things that we cannot understand? I love the science fiction book The Black Cloud by Fred Hoyle. The Black Cloud is a superhuman intelligence. And
the Ubermensch. This is the tendency, right? This is we've abandoned the idea of God, and so instead of us being created in God's image, we have created God in our own image, and now we don't have a God that's infinite and personal and in spirit, metaphysical. But now we just have amplified humanity, not divinity. Amplified humanity is not a sufficient explanation. It's just not. It's too limited. And in the beginning, he's talking about how religion is too small. Religion is too small. And I would kind of agree with that. I'm interested in religion insofar as it speaks about theology, but I'm not committed to I'm not committed to religion as such. So I do think sometimes religion can be small, because I think religion sometimes reduces God down into a manageable size, rather than allowing God to be unsafe and large, infinite. We want to keep God kind of safe and manageable. It's interesting. It's interesting to listen to Dawkins at this stage of his life as well.
It approaches Earth and gets in touch with humans, and they ask him to teach them its advanced knowledge. And two of them volunteer to be taught the physics that this creature knows. In both cases, their brains just burn out. They die.
And Dawkins is fascinated by this book. Sorry, that maybe
of an overheated brain, because the human brain is not capable of understanding. And this may well be the case. It may well be that there are profundities which we can never understand. On the other hand, maybe we can understand them, and I'm open-minded about it. I'd like to live another 500 years to see how far the human brain can advance in understanding these things. And as I say, I don't know.
And naturally, somebody who has no teleology wants to live another 500 years, because the end is terrifying in that. Again, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. It's going to determine everything. It's going to determine how we live. And part of that is holding on to the material, because that's all there is. If there is no God, then the material world is all there is. That's the only thing I put my hope in. There is no hope for an afterlife. That's a sad reality.
I want to again turn our attention to something that you alluded to, that it's an important scientific question. If there is a God, an intelligent creator behind the universe, haunting nature, as C.S. Lewis says, this is a very different proposition than if it's a sort of a random, sort of a set of random events, or selective events, actually, the opposite of random. But from a social and cultural perspective, the presence of theism, and I know that this is something that you've spoken about in depth, you've outlined incredibly articulately, of course, the damage that can be done and has been done by religion, the ridiculousness of saying this baby is a Christian, or I don't know, it kind of made me laugh at that. Like, let's say it's a Tottenham fan or something of a baby, and all of this I appreciate. But now that we live in a somewhat, I want to say, simultaneously nihilistic, peculiarly puritanical oddly free of redemption and salvation, a sort of a materialistic, hollow, listless, joyless society. I wonder if this extraction of the mystery isn't a little costly. I don't feel that human beings, in order to flourish, thrive, and communicate lovingly, require a retrospective tumbling into idiocy and superstition. But the humility that comes along with the acceptance that is found at our current frontiers, i.e. the famous hard problem of consciousness, the potential, therefore, that consciousness precedes matter, the odd combination.
Okay, I don't want to let Russell go too far, because then I won't be able to figure out what he's saying. So Dawkins rightly criticizes religion by bringing about some evils in society. Okay, good point. I do think it is also a good point to judge any system, religious or otherwise, not by those people who fail to keep that system consistently. So if Jesus comes and says, love thy neighbor, and you have two Christian groups at war with each other, they're not living consistently with that Christian religious system, if you will. Whereas a atheist who does not believe in God and sees a political enemy and removes that political enemy, they're not necessarily being inconsistent, because there's no God. Then the highest moral standard is myself. And if I get, Machiavelli works this out a little bit. Voltaire even famously said, we can't, we're all atheists, but we can't let the servants know, otherwise they'll slit our throats. Like the outworking of that conclusion that God was no longer watching us and judging our moral behavior is what Russell is saying, that society has not benefited from this. In fact, we have become really efficient at self-destruction ever since we abandoned the idea of God and the mysterious and the supernatural, although I'm not necessarily a fan of that word, but the metaphysical, the spiritual things, the spiritual component of life has been abandoned for something like Richard Dawkins is saying. There's no telos. There's no ultimate end, purpose, or meaning. So, that criticism is, the criticism of religion is fair. I'll grant that. Although I think oftentimes it is thrown at people being inconsistent with whatever religious system they're working with. I think the criticism of atheism is also, which is Russell throwing it out right now, the criticism of atheism is a good criticism, and I think it is consistent with atheism. So I don't know what Dawkins will do with that, because I think that's a pretty good, critique of maybe the system that Dawkins would be in favor of. So at this point, I actually just want to say this one is getting long. And so if you do have to go, it would really help me if you came back to this video or left it playing, because YouTube's going to look at this and look at your average view duration. And when it's a small percentage of the total video, which could be pretty long, YouTube's not going to recommend it to a lot of people. And yet these are the types of conversations that I think need to go out there. And if you're here at this stage, I think that you believe that these are the conversations that need to go out. And people need to encounter these conversations more and more in the mystical, magical world of the internet, where a lot of people spend time. So hang in there with me. Come back if you need to go, or leave it playing in the background while you're at work or something like that. And if you haven't subscribed at this point, I would love to get your subscription as we build this community of people that are interested in meaningful dialogue. If you have subscribed and you know somebody who would benefit from meaningful dialogues like this, share that with a friend. Share it, bring them on board, because we are going to be better having them contribute to the conversation than we would in their absence. I really, truly believe that. The more people that are involved in these types of conversations, you can chat in the the comments section, and I really do love it. I listen, I read those, I listen to what people are trying to say to me, and I take that feedback. And so yeah, share this with a friend, leave it playing, let YouTube know that these are the types of conversations that people should continue to have. So, and thanks for being there with me. Appreciate it.
The odd combination, as observed by Huxley, that exists between the acknowledgement of the nuministic, no, this is actually C.S. Lewis, the acknowledgement of the nuministic and a credo and set of morals and traditions that are somehow connected to this nuministic experience, i.e. there is an awesome creature on the, or be not creature, a creator, or be at the end of the tendrils of the uncanny, and that somehow this bestows upon us a set of duties and obligations. But
at the end of the tendrils of the uncanny, that might have to become a t-shirt.
there are aspects of spiritual life that are aligned to morality that are valuable. And I wonder what you think of the terrains, the sort of psychic terrains that are found through psychedelic experience, through shamanic experience, through the utilization of non-sensory stimulation, which by its nature is difficult to corral into data sets and to lean into empiricism. I wonder if you feel, as I do, that there is a cargo there that we are feeling the lack of in our current decline.
You covered a whole lot of ground there.
I know, but
rather shifting around.
I know, but
Well, and that's the unfortunate thing, because I think Russell is there. He was onto something. He was onto a really good question, okay? The atheist critiques, the past as being overly religious and people not being very kind to one another and maybe abusing religious power. Okay, good critique. But what about today? Are we any better or are we worse off today having abandoned that? Because one could say that's just human nature. It's human nature to abuse power. How do we explain that? Whether it's they're abusing religious power, whether they're abusing ideological power, whether they're abusing political power. People abuse power, and some people abused religious power. But is it consistent with the belief system? That's the question.
you can do all that, can't you? I remember with Jordan Peterson, you wouldn't have that. You wouldn't have a diffuse question. You took issue.
Let me go back first of all to you're talking about the puritanical joylessness.
Yes.
Because that I agree with you, but I feel strongly about that. And I think that this is one of the faults of extreme Islam, that it is joyless, hating of music, hating of dancing, hating of everything that makes life fun. And so I find that there's a difference between evangelical Christianity, for example, and Islam, where evangelical Christianity has this love of music and
But there are also aspects of Islam that are abundant and voluptuous. Sufism, for
there
example.
have been, that's true. But some of the militant Islam at present actually squashes any attempt at enjoyment and fun. So that.
Yeah, he's talking about, there are aspects of where Islam has taken root in certain areas, and they do smash all the art and stuff like that from the previous. Of course, somebody could say that Christians did that as well. And, again, is it just human sin?
That point.
And also the austerity that's in our culture, in our sort of very economically led, materialistic, rationalistic culture, like the sort of the joylessness of contemporary cancel culture, for want of a better, the piety, the puritanism, the moral certainty.
Yeah, I agree about that.
And I think that's a more significant cultural influence at present than militant Islam.
I agree.
Yeah, and what he said about that cultural influence being lacking in redemption, I thought that was a really good point, that he didn't let, or at least so far, we haven't kind of worked that out, because even with the sort of past with Christian, maybe it was a Judeo-Christian values and things like that, there's always a sense of redemption, that people were redeemable. Today, it doesn't exist. There is no grace. And again, isn't that just isn't that a clue that ideology has become the enemy, not just of theology, but of all people who are trying to pursue truth, maybe love and beauty, and all the others, because there is no redemption left.
That Puritanism is horrible. But then you came on to mysticism and the capacity to feel awe, the capacity to respond aesthetically to the universe. And you would be wrong, I think, if you thought that a scientific worldview led down that path. I think that a scientific worldview, you had Neil deGrasse Tyson on, and he's an eloquent spokesman for an aesthetic, a poetic response to the universe, and I subscribe to that. So I think you can get much of what you associate with the mystics that you admire without actually being supernatural about it. You can stay within the realm of the natural, the materialistic, and yet have all the aesthetic response that you do have to the universe and to life.
Knowledge is the enemy of enchantment. Maybe knowledge is often the enemy of enchantment. I appreciate Dawkins here in the sense that he still kind of maintains some level of enchantment. Again, I wonder where that comes from, if he has previously admitted that there is no telos. How are you enchanted with a world that is just material? Maybe that's why, if Dawkins is really still enchanted with a world that is only material, I guess I have to give him some respect there for maybe being consistent. Yet I feel like it's inconsistent with his whole thing on teleology, that there is no telos. There is no... It looks like it's designed, but it's not.
So there's two areas that from my admittedly caroming and diffuse question that you didn't cover, and one is the emergence of consciousness. There is nothing in biological processes that can indicate from whence consciousness emerges.
That you call it the hard problem. It is the hard problem, and all philosophers and scientists admit that it's a hard problem. It's an unsolved problem, but unsolved problems are there to be solved. It doesn't mean because it's so far unsolved that it's never going to be solved. And I am materialist enough to be convinced that it has to have a solution. Consciousness must be a manifestation of brain stuff, the materialistic brain stuff. I don't understand how that came about, but science has a history of not understanding and then later understanding. So I wouldn't write off just because we don't understand something yet, we're never going to.
Often,
Isn't this just the God of the gaps? Again, we used to say, okay, we can't explain this, so God must have done it. And now we're saying, okay, we can't explain this, but it must have a naturalistic explanation. So we've just taken God and replaced it with human reason and our ability to understand the natural world. And again, trying not to be too harsh on Dawkins, is it his commitment to an ideology that does not allow him to see that this was his criticism of religion, of spiritual thinking, of theology. His criticism of theology is that it's a replacement for human ignorance. And now that we have enough science to know stuff, we don't need God anymore. And the stuff we know gets us a little bit further into the realm of the unknown. And then we don't need God, so we'll replace it with just human consciousness is just brain stuff. This is like Carl Sagan saying we're all star stuff. We're just the stuff of stars.
The idea that when we get into the quantum, what do you think is the relationship between consciousness and the double slit experiment? And because I guess the woo-woo mystical approach that I promised I wasn't going to use on you, but sort of now want to a little bit, is it an indication that consciousness itself could be the prima materia of, inverted commas, reality, or perhaps even the universe?
I don't think so.
Why not?
I'm familiar with the idea, and I'm familiar with the idea that consciousness resides in every particle in the universe, that kind of thing. Consciousness, whatever else it is, I think it's a manifestation of complexity. And so it'll be the complexity of brains, complexity of computers in the future perhaps, a complexity of whatever passes for brains in extraterrestrial life. But complexity means massive organization of different units connected together in complicated ways. Particles, electrons, atoms are much too simple to have anything remotely approaching consciousness.
Perhaps there are gradients of consciousness, and in fact, beyond particles having consciousness, or being, I suppose what I'm suggesting is not sort of panpsychism, but the quality of consciousness is within material, but rather that material emerges from consciousness, that consciousness is a precondition for being, and it's only at advanced states of evolution where consciousness becomes accessible, that as intelligence becomes more complex, as the mechanics of the mind become more complex, there's sort of an access to it. And I know that sounds sort of slightly hocus pocus, but perhaps only in the same way that radio signals and the potential for electricity always existed, but until the mechanics were developed to access them, they were redundant and irrelevant. And I think that if, with the hard problem of consciousness there, with the what Terence McKenna memorably and beautifully described as the free miracle of the Big Bang, give us one free miracle and we'll describe the rest. It seems to me that that within that which is unknown, one idea recurs to me, and this is of unity, that separateness, that material ought not be the defining lens through which we understand reality, but the potential of a oneness. And for me, you're interested, you're a scientist, and you're an eminent and well-respected scientist, and I'm embarrassed even to put before you theories dreamt up in crack houses and bedsits in the years between 1994 and 2001. But what I am, I suppose, saying is that...
Yeah, the hard problem of consciousness, And wouldn't it help if we expanded our worldview to include a realm beyond the material? So we have the material world, and we have the heavenly realm. That would be my sort of, at least my attempt at working out a biblical cosmology. There is more than just the material realm. And so the hard problem of consciousness is a hard problem for the materialist, but maybe not so much for people that have a worldview, a cosmography, a cosmology that would include those things that exist sort of in the gaps between material. Like I write a sentence, and you have the material there. You see the words written down, but the meaning of those words brought forth into your mind is immaterial, but it's real. So we can't disregard those things which are immaterial. We just can't do it. We have to have a worldview that allows us to explain the immaterial.
The impact that it has on your discipline to consider whether or not there's an omnipotent force or some sort of cohesive deity or an author of the universe, or however you want to regard it. It's so significant and important, and it changes everything. I feel like it changes everything in the way that we organize cultures, observably so. It feels to me that since the Enlightenment, since we've had an irrational, individualistic, materialistic, egocentric culture, it seems to me that what the mechanics that emerge from that are indeed rather selfish, and that the metaphors that we use are somehow creating a culture that is antithetical to what might be a favorable outcome were we to use a different image system. And again, I don't...
And he's touching right on that. What comes into your mind when you think about God will determine everything about you. I mean, it really does change society. Our theology works out in cities, in towns, in how we structure school systems, and how we do politics. Our theology works out. And his point is true. Like, once we become sort of reductionist, modern, materialistic people, we struggle to find answers. We struggle to order society in a way that makes sense. And I think that's because humanity is designed, humanity was made to worship God. That is our purpose. That is the telos, that we are meant to come together united around a worship of the God who's actually there. And when we order society according to that, which I would say maybe we never have, that's where we have unity. A unity that allows us to preserve the diversity of what we see in humanity. So we don't have to become one in order to have unity. We can all join together in a diverse worship of one God. Kind of still working that one out as well. but you can check out the Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan podcast for that one. I'll link it.
I'm not asking scientists to start glibly accepting, oh yeah, no, there probably is a God. But what I am, I suppose, asking is it possible to say that in the material realm, as Alfred Russel Wallace appears to have accepted, there is a necessity for critique and rigor and analysis, and there can't be any sort of woo-woo acceptance that peahens just like the look of those tail feathers, honey. But elsewhere there is an unknowable mystery. We know awe when we feel it. We know, as C.S. Lewis contests, when we have done wrong. What are these sets of visceral codes? What is this awe? And whilst in botany and biology it's possible to emerge that which looks like intelligent design is a kind of, I believe, a kind of teleology, an intention spilling into the world and adapting in harmony with its environment from which it cannot be separated, that when it comes to organising a society, the ideas that might be derived from the acceptance of, gosh, what am I trying to say? That unity and love underscore reality, that meaning can be derived from it, that a sort of an open-heartedness to it rather than a sort of a foreclosing cynicism.
Yeah. When we become ideological, we close off. When we're not ideological, we have that openness. That's my take. You may have a different take. I'm definitely interested to hear it, but I think that's what Russell is touching on.
These are emotional words, and words like love, to me, are things that emerge from nervous systems, especially human ones. And to regard something like love, something emotive like that, as lurking in the material world doesn't sound at all convincing to me. And I think you've got the cart before the horse. Things like love emerge late in evolution as a consequence of the evolution of highly complicated nervous systems, and they don't come first.
I don't think Dawkins has a very good definition of love then. I think we're talking about two different things. If you say that something like love is just a chemical reaction, let's say, and I don't know, he didn't say that exactly, but I'm trying to extrapolate out what he's getting at. If I say love is just a chemical reaction, go to your spouse, someone you committed to, someone you have a contract with. Maybe you've had children with this person. You've lived with that person, maybe for decades upon decades. You have sacrificed for that person. You would continue to sacrifice for that person. You would give your life for that person. And you're looking that person in the face and you say, darling, I'm having a chemical reaction. I don't know that that's a good replacement for the word love and for what we're talking about when we say love, what the Christian worldview would depict when we're talking about love, a unconditional, everlasting, self-sacrificial love towards someone who is unworthy of that love. That is not something that evolved. In fact, that is contradictory to evolution. You see this in, like, if animals are attacked in the wild, they will abandon their young because they can always have more offspring. And sometimes that's not true. Sometimes they will defend, but to a certain level. They'll say, okay, I can always have more kids, right? But the idea of self-sacrifice is contrary to the sort of quote-unquote selfish gene idea that we want to just perpetuate our genetic code. That's why we're here. That's our telos. Then self-sacrificial love towards people who are unworthy of that love should not exist. Evolution should not have allowed that to exist. And yet it does. So I don't think evolution it doesn't have the explanatory power to describe the world that at least I see. Now, Dawkins may just define love as a chemical reaction. That's fine. He can live in that world. I don't want him to. I want Dawkins to have a more robust worldview that includes a contact with his creator. That would be my prayer, if that doesn't sound too religious and woo-woo. But it's just, to some degree, that is hard. It's hard to hear.
Now, you also, earlier on, used words like egocentric and selfish and things. Again, I don't think that kind of language belongs in when you're talking about science, materialism, again, selfishness is something that emerges from living things. And I've written a book about that, Selfish Gene.
Yeah. So, okay. He can't see that is he contradicting himself, but he can't see it? He just said the word selfishness shouldn't belong in the natural, like the material realm. And yet he wrote the book called The Selfish Gene. I mean, maybe I'm misunderstanding him here, but he's thinking of it as too emotional of a word and that it doesn't have any place in sort of this scientific, materialistic conversation. So then why did you write the book called The Selfish Gene? Again, maybe I missed something there.
Which is actually about selfish gene rather than selfish individual. But nevertheless, it's not the right level of language to use for pre-living entities like pure physics.
So you would say then that there are discrete categories. There is the domain of science where the lexicon and nomenclature of science are appropriate. Then there is the domain of morality and the domain of social engineering.
I think I would say that, and those latter two domains are appropriate where you have life, and especially where you have human life.
Do you feel, Professor, that and this is not something that I would attribute to you or certainly make you culpable for, but that's not an authority that I would claim to have, but that almost, in fact, since you've risen to prominence, that the language of science has entered into the realm of politics, society, that there's no question that in fact, isn't it somewhat disingenuous to claim that these two worlds aren't fused?
Well,
whereas
what do you think of that?
Galileo, right? But I suppose that there's this assumption that science and religion are at odds with one another, and which I would say is, who's that dude Bruno, the guy that imagined the countless, was burned at the stake.
Burned at the stake.
Yeah, that guy. But in a sense that the true religion, and open-mindedness to unity, to non-judgment, to beauty, to service, to kindness, to quite simple values, is not at odds with scientific inquiry, but acknowledges that there is a different type of language required. I think since the advent of, whenever rationalism, materialism, say post-Enlightenment thinking becomes the sort of a dominant purview, that we do use scientific discourse and scientific language. And my God, look at the last couple of years. Science, some of which has subsequently been proven to be somewhat shaky, shall we say, is used to underwrite political action, is used to underwrite social policy.
What are you thinking there?
A couple of examples. Very broadly, the idea of social Darwinism, the idea that it's sort of acceptable, like the utilization of Darwinian ideas to legitimize
that's
poverty.
An appalling. I mean, that should never happen. You should never use scientific ideas, inject them into ideology in that way. And that was a terrible thing that happened in the late 19th, early 20th century.
Was it injected into that ideology, or is it a product of that ideology? Is it the logical outworking of that? Again, go and look at the subtitle to Darwin's Origin of the Species. It's not a foreign idea. I think it's consistent with the materialism.
And then I was going to say, like during the pandemic, that some of the use of data and the way that data was conveyed. And I would again say that my argument would be that science, or particularly pharmacology, is a subset of an economic system. It's not its own separate silo. Only the clinical trials that are taking place are the clinical trials that are profitable. Where do these places get their grants from? Who is funding that? What is the intention behind it? There is no of course, I understand, double-blind experiments. I understand that what a clinical trial ought to be. I understand what peer-reviewed papers are. But I also understand how economics works, and I understand how Pfizer operates, for example.
Yeah, you're probably right about that, I'm not here to defend the economic influx into the way science is done. It's probably true to say that to a certain extent, money talks when it comes to which science is done. But that's not something you can blame science itself for. I mean, science is a dispassionate search for truth, and that's the sort of science I care about.
And me too.
A dispassionate search for truth, dislodged from any idea of God, up until a certain point. And once you start putting God into the conversation, that's where we have to not have a dispassionate search for truth. But I still don't think, again, without having a purpose, without having a designer behind that purpose, why would it be bad for some people to abuse science and use scientific language, or use the power of science to convince people? to manipulate those people and make lots of money off of it. Is there a problem with that? If there's no God, like what are we? Why are we hot and bothered by that? People in power use their power over and against people who don't have that power. You know, talk about dispassionate. I mean, I feel like that would be more consistent with the materialist atheist worldview. But again, I mean, I am speaking from my own worldview, which is a theological, which is one that is informed by my biblical theology as best as I can have it.
Me too. And then, but sort of closer to home, even your analysis of Islam is the deployment of scientific critiques to a realm like I'm not Muslim, but I hold the faith of Islam in high regard, and I would say that the critiques one could level at Islam, one could equally level at secularism. You could say, oh look, these atrocities were carried out in the name of Islam. These atrocities were carried out in the name of Christendom. These atrocities were carried out in the name of late capitalist imperialism. The atrocities are what's significant, and how people undergird them, whether it's through science or capitalism or Islam or Christianity, is not as relevant. And I feel it's just a sort of a particular moment in time where religion was used to undergird violence.
True.
And
yes.
now people...
Yeah. We talked about this earlier on in this episode. And the question then that I have is, what best explains human nature? Why do humans have this propensity towards just manipulating power? Again, from a biblical worldview, I'd say that's the presence of sin. Ultimately, we are in rebellion. There is no harmony between us and our Creator. And so, yeah, we're just here to exploit one another if we don't get back into harmony with the Creator. I mean, that's been going on since ancient times. I mean, look at Cain and Abel. We're still there. We're still grappling with our sin, and that's the language that helps us describe what's going on. That's the biblical language that would help us describe what's going on. Sinful people abused let's say the Catholic Church at one point, and there's bad ideas that got into the Catholic Church, and people abused that system. Then there were bad ideas that got into democracy, let's say. There were bad ideas that got into capitalism, and bad people abused those systems. But why? Well, they're sinful. They're in rebellion to the Creator. So that's what people do when they're in rebellion. That's why we need harmony. That's why we need to be evangelistic in that sense of bringing people back into harmony with their Creator. Otherwise, we're always going to see these things happen. They're going to continue to happen until the end.
People will use different
Christianity
ideas.
had its bad moments in the Middle Ages, and Islam is having its bad moments now. Perhaps you could say that.
And in both, and there have been there's been sort of a collision of cultures in both cases that, for me, reduce the significance of the doctrine or dogma or however you regard those faiths. For me, it's like these seem to be, for me, my analysis would be this is the pursuit of power that's significant here. But I suppose...
Well, and I think his critique of the Middle Ages is wrong. I think his critique of even modern Islam is wrong. It's not like ancient Islam. Yeah, I mean... What was ancient Islam up to? I'll leave that on the floor for more discussion.
I wonder, what is the place of faith in forming a culture? What is the place of trust? Like ideas that are unscientific, definitely.
Because we don't understand something, the appropriate response to that is to work on it, to try to understand it. The appropriate response is not to say, because science doesn't understand X, therefore religion does. Therefore, what some mystic has said or what some religious person has said must be the truth because science hasn't got the answer. The fact that science hasn't got the answer doesn't mean that anything else has got the answer. And when we talked about those deep, profound...
That doesn't seem like a very scientific answer to me. Wouldn't you look everywhere for the answer if you're truly trying to make observations? And again, we're just back at the God of the Gaps situation where now we're not... Okay, the placeholder for human ignorance is future science. We're not saying anything different. His criticism of religion is that the placeholder for human ignorance is religious ideas.
Problems, the deep mysteries. I mean, I was talking about the black cloud. There may be things that science will never understand, but if science doesn't understand them, nothing else will. That's where I would...
Wow. That's where I just kind of go, that's a powerful ideological statement right there. Nothing else will. How could we possibly know that nothing else will? You would have to have all knowledge. You would have to have infinite knowledge in order to know that nothing else will know these things. And if you have infinite knowledge, you are God. So we're back to theology here. Anselm's epistemology, I think, would help as well. Belief comes before knowledge. We have to believe that things are knowable before we can actually pursue that knowledge. We have to believe that the world is rational and understandable from the human mind. And then the question is, why does it all work? Why is the world rational and understandable? Why is it that my human mind can understand the world? You look at the work by Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards. It's the Privileged Planet, where they talk about not only the conditions for observation being fine-tuned, but that the best place for making those observations is also the only place that has observers, people who can make those observations. So the correlation there there's no explanation in the natural world. Why is it that the planet that is best suited for life is also best suited for observation? Somebody wants us to pursue, somebody wants us to understand, somebody wants us to know. And we just assume that because that's our reality, that we take place, that we're here and we're making observations, but that the correlation between the existence of life capable of making observations and an environment that's observable is not something that naturalism can explain. I don't think.
Stick my toes in.
Then what of perennialism? What of the consistent emergence not only of myths and archetypes throughout culture, but also of ideals and hierarchies of behaviours that somewhat consistently emerge?
Well, ideals, moral ideals, are another matter. I wasn't talking about morals. I'm talking about truth. I'm talking about understanding of the universe, understanding of the deep mysteries. Things like consciousness. I mean, that is a deep mystery. And if science doesn't understand consciousness, which it doesn't yet, if science will never understand consciousness, then nothing will.
I'm not talking about morals. I'm talking about truth. There's a fragmentation. There's a sense that those two things don't interrelate. I think that is one problem we have in our modern education system. We sort of dislocate disciplines. The moral and philosophical, maybe morality belongs in the philosophical, and science belongs in truth. Well, no, truth belongs. I don't know. I don't see that. I don't have that fragmented view of the world. I think truth has a lot to say about morality. I think morality has a lot to teach me about what is true. And I pursue that kind of harmony and not a fragmentation.
Is it not possible that there are truths that are beyond the current purview of science?
Definitely, and I just said that.
And what are they again? Moral truths.
Oh, well, moral truths are another matter, and we can talk about moral truths, but that's not what I'm actually mainly concerned about. I mean,
what are the ones that are beyond science?
Well, truths about the universe, dark matter, dark energy, consciousness, the origin of the laws of physics. These are profoundly difficult problems which science doesn't yet know the answer to. All I'm saying is that if science doesn't know the answer to it, nor does religion.
And that you don't think sort of a kind of a poetic or intuitive or mystical understanding, and when you inventory them in that manner, I'm inclined to agree that a scientific understanding, an empirical, demonstrable understanding would be valuable. But what I feel that we're, the interface that we're operating at is that I'm saying that say, if you want to sling together the sort of post-Enlightenment values with a little bit of Nietzsche, God is dead and we can't get the blood off our hands, or we have killed him, we can't get the blood off our hands, is that where we find ourselves now is that in our culture, if you look at the sort of the morality that was formed during the pandemic period, lent into scientific understanding for its authority, for its moral authority. For example, it is immoral if you don't undertake these medical procedures. It's immoral if you don't remain within your home. Well, it turned out that morality was incorrect. And one might argue that different interests were being served by that being presented as a moral decision, when in fact it wasn't. Just to be less cryptic, for example, that Pfizer never clinically trialed their vaccines for transmission, and yet the way that the vaccines were presented to the public was as a remedy against transmission, right? So I know this is not your field of expertise, but this is but one example of how, in the way that the church once would have been used as the sort of storehouse of a collective morality, the institution of science is currently being used, and I would say it's equally fallible and similarly being utilized to undergird the interests of the powerful, that all the while that people were being burned at the stake and martyred and slung off cliffs, that really they were not like this. Are you happy with this, God? But really they were interested in power. And in the same way, well, we can show you the data. This is, it's being used in the same way, and it's about power. It's about something that's abstracted, and from that.
Yeah, so the only thing that I would say is that I think the church used that inconsistently. I don't think that they were not being consistent with biblical theology, but a materialistic, atheistic worldview is being consistent within that, with their own framework. And again, you can see Richard doesn't want to talk about morality. He's treating morality like doesn't belong in this conversation. It's like, well, it does.
You can deduce that science is neither good or bad. It's about sort of cold hard facts, and religion is neither good or bad. It's an attempt to deal with the unknowable and to derive from the unknowable a sense of meaning and purpose. And if you want to apply empiricism to this, Professor, what are the results of a successful religion? People behave as if there is a God.
You need to stop and let me get a word in edgeways.
Come on, I've done loads of quiet.
The advice about vaccine and whether it prevents transmission, as I understand it, what appears to be moral advice was kind of more what they thought to be common sense, which might not have been actually.
Ooh, okay, so doesn't that come into play, though, where he's like, hey, science doesn't have an answer yet, but future science will. And then his example with the vaccine was they thought they had gotten the science right, but it turns out that they didn't. So if future science we're just kicking the can all down the road, I mean, we are lost people. I mean, that is horrific. The conclusions that we could draw today that then, quote unquote, future science would, tell us, oh, we got that wrong. I mean, good grief. I mean, haven't we already seen this play out? So again, is it the ideology? Am I missing something? But he can't see that he just previously pointed towards his hope in future science, his hope in science, and that if science doesn't get it right, religion certainly won't. That if science doesn't get it right today, maybe they'll get it right tomorrow. It seems like the people pushing these vaccines or whatever they were, or whatever it might be, use your imagination there, it gets pretty dark. They, in the name of science, thought that they were doing it right. And now we're looking back and we're going, well, maybe they got it wrong. And now I'm afraid of what the next future science will tell us is right. And who controls that future science? That is a dystopian world to imagine, for sure.
Based upon what you could call the measles model where a virus, a disease like measles, where it is actually a public good, it's actually a social good to get vaccinated, because the more people who are vaccinated, the less chance the epidemic has to get going. And so if you refuse to be vaccinated, you are, in a sense, a problem, a social problem. And I think
And what does our current science tell us to do about those social problems? And will our future science prove that we've got it right?
I'm really merely using it to say that the presence of power is what is significant in both the cases of science and religion. Neither of those.
Unfair. I think that's unfair. I think,
is that the good point you said that was approaching?
Yeah,
We didn't get to that.
What I'm calling the measles model was possibly the best they had to go on at the time. And if that was wrong, then that's a pity. But it was the best advice they had available at the time. It was assumed that
they didn't communicate it like that. I mean, I'm only continuing because you're continuing.
Yeah.
They communicated it with a good degree of certainty, and this erroneous assumption that they made was very profitable for some of those powerful interests in the world and allowed governments to govern and regulate in ways that are increasingly becoming difficult.
I wouldn't wish to make the economic accusation at that point. I think it was a fair point that epidemiological wisdom at the time, and still is, that vaccination is a public good. And if there's some disease where it's not the case that vaccination is a public good because vaccination does not actually guard against transmission, then that's something we need to take account of in the future. But I don't think I would wish to point fingers and say there was economic interests which were overriding in this case. I think it was, if there was I'm not even saying there was a mistake, but if there was a mistake, then I think it was an honest mistake.
We've also been...
And that is, again, it seems to me like an ideological commitment. A person committed to science, here's defending other people that, quote unquote, are committed to science. Seems, again, like sort of not an ability to really think critically about what's going on in the world. And when you see that in a scientist, it would cause me to be skeptical about any of the other science that they have done. It's like in this one area, you don't seem like you're willing to accept all the possible explanations, which if you're doing good science, you should. So I think in other areas, you're probably not willing to accept all the possible explanations. If explanations come up against your ideological commitment, you disregard those. And so I think I'm skeptical about your ability to do science, going back to John Lennox's point.
Incredible information on this, which that's to outline now would sort of take us such a long while, but there are some quite credible sources that make it appear like that the institutions of the media, the government, the pharmaceutical industry, unelected global bodies like WEF, WHO, philanthropic organisations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who had previously run sort of pandemic, gamed out what might happen in a pandemic situation.
This will probably get flagged. I might have to cut this out. But you notice that he said appears like. This is what it appears like. And do you remember Dawkins in the beginning saying the natural world appears to be designed, but we know it's not? And here Russell is saying it appears that these are the circumstances around the pandemic. And so again, the scientists would want to pursue whatever the appearance is, and then come to a logical conclusion about that appearance. But we sort of have Richard Dawkins maybe doing the same thing with the pandemic that he does with natural selection and this natural explanation for life on Earth. It doesn't matter to him what it appears like. Even if it appears like there's design in the natural world, we know there's not. Even if it appears people had other motivations during this pandemic, I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. Seems unscientific to me.
Simple example, at the beginning of the pandemic, Albert Bourla, CEO of Pfizer, said it would be unconscionable to profit from this pandemic and that they would ensure that didn't happen. And yet, by the end of the pandemic, curiously, Pfizer had profited by $108 billion.
If I remain silent, it's not because I accept what you're saying, it's because I just don't know enough. But
I wonder if I remain silent, it's not because I accept what you're saying, but because I just don't know enough. Might be a good thing for Dawkins to consider in the remaining years of his life. Because we don't know enough, maybe it's bad to make assumptions. This is where I think theology really has a strong footing. See, I think what we understand about God has been revealed to us. It's not what we have come up with. It's not our understanding. It's not humanity trying to understand God, which is why I lean towards the biblical worldview. I think that this is God's revealed truth to us. So theology has come down to us and been revealed to us. It's not something that we worked out on our own, beginning from human wisdom. And so that's why it's the queen of the sciences. It's steeped in humility. And once we start to understand this about theology, we can then understand all the other sciences, because we're trudging forward with that humility and understanding that the foundation of our knowledge is revelation. It's been revealed to us by God. He has revealed himself in the natural world. He has revealed himself in the Word, and he's revealed himself in his Son, Jesus. And that's how we come to know God. That's the foundation for all other knowledge. And I think that I really do think that if your starting point is something else, like human rationality, human reason, then you're going to end in an ideology that doesn't allow you to carry on a conversation with a Russel Brand, which is what maybe is happening if we're really honest. There's parts of this conversation that are really painful, and maybe it's because there's no dialogue that can take place between somebody who's ideologically committed and somebody who's philosophically committed, somebody who loves wisdom. And I'm giving Russel Brand the benefit of the doubt there, but it's the Homer worked this out with the Cyclops living in the caves. They can only see one thing. They're myopic, and so there's no philosophy, and they're isolated. Each Cyclops lives in his own cave, so there can't be any community. There's no dialogue because of that myopia, that inability to do philosophy. And so we see it kind of working out here, kind of painfully, and sad to say that this interview has become for me an analogy of why I think ideology can be so detrimental, because it restricts our ability to do dialogue and philosophy. It prevents us from having dialogue. And you can kind of see that with Russell and Richard here.
Of science as the sort of godhead, forgive the phrase, of a new sort of moral authority in order to bypass the ordinary discernment and a way that's become, in that instance, for example, I would say undemocratic. You can certainly say it's
moral authority. I would say it was more that science has to give the best advice available, and it's not a case of moral advice, it's a case of just
it should never be fused with morality. It should always be, this is experience, this is what we know right now.
Yes.
And morality is not our domain. We do not have the tools for morality.
Yes, fair enough.
So, Professor, though,
maybe something should be said about the domain of philosophy and theology then as well. Like, we're making claims that there is no God from a scientific standpoint. Doesn't seem like science is powerful enough to do that. You'd have to have all knowledge in order to make an absolute claim in the negative sense, like atheism does.
Well, I guess where I would like to sort of advance this conversation, and is there anything, how come you're doing this?
Well, last year's book was Flights of Fancy, about flight, but I'm also...
Did you catch that? That was quick. Russell just quickly says, why are you doing this interview? Okay. And Dawkins, he answers it. This was my question going into this interview. Why is Richard Dawkins sitting down with Russel Brand to have this conversation? I mean, they go on for an hour and 11 minutes. I'm not going to cover everything, but again, this is a long one. We are unpacking this, and sometimes you need to, kind of hang in there with the funny thing about good conversation, and I'm not claiming that this is that, but the funny thing about good conversation is that the time passes so quickly. You know that? You've had that experience. I don't know that happens on the internet. It's like, wow, this is going on for forever. It's like somehow that sense of timelessness within a good conversation is lost because we're engaging through an electronic medium, unfortunately. But at the very beginning there, I was asking, like, why is Dawkins doing this? I mean, without even really thinking, I figured that question would have put Dawkins off. Like, wait, why am I doing this? He immediately launches into a book that he wrote. He's here to sell a book. He's not here to have meaningful dialogue. He's Richard Dawkins. He writes books. He's here to sell a book. Ben Stein put this to him in his interview in the movie Expelled, or the documentary Expelled. He said, what would happen if you met God one day? And God is like, look, I gave you this multi-million-dollar, book sales. What would you say to God? And Dawkins said, well, sir, you didn't give me enough evidence to believe in you, but here he is. Again, is there, with no sense of a telos, an ultimate meaning, purpose, end goal, ultimate design, the purpose of life is to get as much out of the material as you can. And I'm making an assumption here, and I hope it's not unfair to Dawkins. But is he just trying to make money? Is that it? I mean, he's a materialist. He has no hope in the future. So he's got to make his money now. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go on Russel Brand's podcast because he's got millions and millions of followers and people might be interested in buying my book. I hope that's not the case. But again, I hope that if that is the case, we could see how detrimental just being ideologically committed is. And I say that as a Christian person who I'm pretty firm in my beliefs. But being firm in your beliefs is, I think, different from having this ideological kind of blinders, that myopia that Homer kind of gestures to in, is that the Iliad or the Odyssey? I guess it's the Odyssey. I probably got that wrong. Let me know.
Starting a podcast of my own. I think that's probably why I'm
Yes,
doing it.
go on then. What's that?
Well, it's called Poetry of Reality, and science is the poetry of reality. And I haven't really started it yet, but I want to ask your advice about how to run a podcast.
There we are. Here's my advice, Richard. I know you didn't ask me. You asked Russell. Here's my advice. Please work off the ideology. If I'm right, and I hope I'm not, if there's a strong ideological commitment, your podcast is going to suck. You're not going to have meaningful dialogue because you will never interview somebody who's willing to challenge you. I hope that this is transformational for Richard Dawkins. I hope sitting down and having a podcast is something transformational because he'll have real conversation with real people. And this takes me to the Adam Curry interview that he did with Joe Rogan. It was the people around Adam Curry that got him thinking about Jesus. It was the books that they were recommending to him. So he's selling a book and he's launching a podcast. And and if you're a praying person, you're going to pray for Richard Dawkins and say, I hope that this is a transformational experience. It was Anthony Flew was the head atheist before Dawkins. And it was the debate that Anthony Flew had with William Lane Craig, where he put forth the evidence for the resurrection. And Flew just went, I can't. There's no way I can respond to this. I have to look into it. I have to look into it. And he did. And he abandoned his atheism. I pray that this would be transformational for Richard Dawkins. Because I'm a person who believes that there is an ultimate purpose to life. It's my teleology that is influencing my life here. And I'm actually going to spend time and pray for Richard Dawkins. Because ideas influence behavior.
I think it's to tell the truth, the advice I'd give you, it seemed to me to be areas where you would not struggle. Right? Remain rigorously truthful to what you believe in. Speak to people that you are interested in. Be entirely willing to have conversations with people with whom you thoroughly disagree, and enter those conversations in good faith.
Sounds like excellent advice. Yes,
that's sort of how I do it. And whenever I'm not doing that, I get really bored really, really quickly, and I do loathe to be bored, Professor. Yeah. So
I love that. I mean, I hadn't listened to this part of the podcast yet, and I love that advice. And I think it is boring when you're not, when you're just stuck in your own ideas, not willing to have meaningful conversation with people. That is boring. And this is an attempt to not be boring. I hope I'm not boring. Probably is. I mean, I've been sitting down for a while. I got to take a break. So maybe this is where. Maybe we end it here. There's about 20 minutes left on this podcast for you to check out. And of course, I won't cover everything even now. I'll leave some of it on the floor. So check out the podcast yourself. There is a book that I wanted to recommend that I think would be interesting within this conversation of Richard Dawkins. It's called The Faith of the Fatherless, and he goes into prominent atheists and looks at kind of the presence of their fathers in their lives, and a lot of them seems like they had sort of absent fathers, or they didn't have a good experience with their father. I'm not making a claim about Dawkins. I just think that this is an interesting book for further reference. The Faith of the Fatherless. He goes into people like Voltaire, Hobbes, Hume, Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, and all these others. And his conclusion is that there's this defective father that's present in their lives, and that later on they reject the idea of God. And of course, God presents himself as a father. That's how he reveals himself. I did a video on that if you want to check it out, looking at some of that in more depth. But I thought this was interesting. He looks at some people who are Christian believers. I just noticed G.K. Chesterton here. But yeah, it was this quote. It was this quote from H.G. Wells that really stood out for me. Again, this is not the book. This is someone doing a book review. But H.G. Wells wrote, "My father was away at cricket." And I think his mother, realized more and more as the years dragged on, without material alleviation, that our Father and our Lord, on whom to begin with she had perhaps counted unduly, were also away, playing perhaps their own sort of cricket in some remote quarter of the starry universe. And I'm not making a claim about Dawkins. I don't know anything about his upbringing, his family, but it is interesting to think what would cause someone to be so committed to an atheistic worldview. Now, of course, he's made a lot of money writing books and things like that. So maybe that's it. If you're a materialist, I mean, you better make some money, because there's no other meaning in life other than to stuff yourself with some type of at least made up happiness. Anyway, I'm drawing on, making a longer podcast, even longer, but I find this to be somewhat fascinating. Well, I find it to be fascinating and somewhat tragic is really what it is. Because again, I don't hold any ill will towards Dawkins. I'm not even doing this as an apologetic. I'm not trying to respond to Dawkins. I care for people, and I see Dawkins as being a person who seems to be trapped in an ideology. And I don't want people to be trapped in ideology. I want people to be free to think, and particularly to think deeply and meaningfully about God. So I hope that this podcast can help you. I hope that if you're watching on YouTube, you can share this, like it, subscribe, do all that stuff, because I think that's kind of the interesting thing about the modern world that we live in, is that information is so shareable. I think we're still able to build community even though we're able to share information at such a fast pace. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for sticking around if you have made it to the end, and I will catch you in the next one.